I'll kick it off if that's okay, Adnan. I
Please.
want to say welcome everybody to joining us for our early feasibility study discussion. It's a joint effort between MDIC and the Jacobs Institute, and really appreciate all of you being a part of this discussion. We've got we got five speakers here today. We're going to try and have each session be about 4 to 5 minutes of talk with a minute or two of questions, and then a good 30 minutes of discussion for Q&A. And our hope is that everybody here on the event will have a chance to chat about this. Your moderators for today are me. I'm Chip Hance. I am chairman of MDIC. I'm a volunteer board member, and I've been a volunteer working on this activity of early feasibility studies for 6, 7 years now. And Dr. Adnan Siddiqui, who I think most of you know around the table up at University of Buffalo, who's been a wonderful partner and champion of the early feasibility study initiative for neurovascular studies here. So we're real excited to have a chance to address this. We've done these before, and what we found is we were broadcasting too much information and not getting into some hard discussion about what was working, what wasn't working. And so we're going to try and attempt to do something different. Let me kick off just 2 or 3 slides just to get you a little bit warmed up on who you're seeing here today. So if you go to the next slide. So I represent the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, and I'd like to thank Philips, Siemens, and J&J, as well as many others who are industry members of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, together with FDA and CMS. So this is a group that is, of more than 70 different companies, FDA, CMS, in a public-private partnership that work on issues of regulatory science. And if you go to the next slide, we've specifically tackled over the last 5 to 6 years how to streamline early feasibility studies within the U.S. And the thought is that both FDA and industry share that a streamlined effort for early clinical research gets the most transformative and innovative products through the regulatory process and into the hands of patients of need in the most timely fashion, but that we need to work collaboratively on this ecosystem so that we achieve that speedy review process and collaboration with regulatory authorities for for startups. So if you go to the next page here, Eileen, this is some of the things that Eileen Mijas, who's advancing the slides right here, our director, works for MDIC, and she and Kiande work together on trying to streamline collaborative efforts in a number of different therapeutic categories, neurovascular being one of them, but also structural heart, electrophysiology, heart failure, or other areas of great interest, neuromodulation too. We work to bring together industry and other parties that are interested in this together with FDA to streamline processes. Things like we're working on is how to make an early feasibility study insurance for a clinical sponsor side to be as effective as possible. We also work on master clinical trial agreements that allow for a sponsor who's new to the early feasibility study process in the United States to have a template to fast track that particular activity, which can be very time consuming. And there's more that comes up. It's probably listed on the next page right here, which is too small for me to even read. But we'll send these slides out after the fact, but over the last 6, 7 years, a number of tools have been developed that allow a industry sponsor to move quickly through the early feasibility study process in partnership with clinical sites to try and achieve a fast and efficient clinical study. So more information will go out after the meeting. But with that as kind of a quick intro, I'd suggest that we go on to our first speaker, who is Dr. Andy Farb, who was one of the co-authors of the original guidance document some 10 plus years ago for the creation of the early feasibility study program. So Andy, let me turn it over to you, please.
Actually, just before Andy gets started, I want to make sure that people know that the goal here is a discussion and engagement and interaction. And I believe some people may want to stay off camera. That's fine. But instead of being simply attendees and take note takers, and that's fine, you can certainly do that. By being a panelist, you at least have the opportunity to raise a question, to raise your hand, to engage, and have the panel address some of the issues that you might have. So panelist does not mean we're going to force you to speak in any way, shape, or form. We just have a few speakers. They already know it, and we are fine. But this is just so that you get a chance to engage and interact. So, but if you want to stay out of it, that's fine as well. So with that, Andy, all yours.
Thanks, Anand. Thanks, Chip. I'm the co-leader of the Center's Early Feasibility Studies program, and we're really happy to partner and help support the effort that's going on through MDIC with you all on the webinar today. So about 10 years ago, we started developing the guidance and the program, and it's all about increasing patient access to potentially beneficial early-stage medical devices. And we really wanted to change the environment and the culture to get U.S. sites more engaged and involved with these early device studies, and then enhance collaboration amongst all the parties involved, the developers, the industry, regulators, payers, and investigators, and do it in such a fashion that we protect patients as best we can with novel devices under the IDE regulations. Next slide. So for those unfamiliar with what an early feasibility study is, we came up with this definition that it involves a small number of initial subjects for a device that is typically early in development before it's been finalized. Importantly, it doesn't necessarily involve the first clinical use, such that if a device has been used outside the United States initially, that still can fulfill the EFS criteria and be used in an early stage study in the United States. And the key principle is this last one, is when the device development has reached a stage that you can no longer obtain useful information with additional non-clinical tests, or just non-clinical tests are unavailable, and with benefit risk considerations on the table, that's appropriate to start a clinical study. And the program does offer enhanced FDA interactions where we can give you feedback on your device design and clinical data developmental strategies. Next slide, please. So this slide is particularly important to the sponsors when thinking about the non-clinical data that is required to support an initial human study in the U.S. That for an EFS, less non-clinical data may be needed for IDE approval versus a larger study. So we calibrate the non-clinical study needs based on the stage of device development, and that those studies do help support basic safety and proof of principle. And we do this by applying this principle that we call just-in-time testing, which is doing the right non-clinical tests at the right time and deferring some non-clinical testing till it is needed to be used to characterize the device to be used in a larger pivotal trial, knowing that doing lots of tests early on for an early stage device may not be all that useful, particularly if the device is modified. That is a common occurrence in early stage clinical use of devices. And so with that, there's increased opportunities to use leverage information to support IDE approval. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide, which is where the value proposition of the EFS program comes in, because we expect that many of these early studies will be learn as you go. You start with an initial number of patients. You find where the device may be particularly useful, where it might need to be improved, and then modify the device under the approved IDE and continue on with the EFS. Or you may have initial success and expand the EFS to additional sites and additional investigators to acquire more data to help inform what that pivotal study design will need to look like. And once you get an adequate amount of data, is to transition to the pivotal trial. And of course, that's the trial that is going to be useful to establish definitive evidence of safety and effectiveness. So let me conclude here. I'll be happy to answer any regulatory questions. Look forward to the discussion. Again, we are very much supportive of the efforts ongoing today. Chip?
Great. So anybody want to unmute and ask a specific question of Andy here?
And again, for those who have joined recently, if you logged in as an attendee, it's kind of harder to ask questions through the Q&A or raising your hands or just unmuting. So I'd recommend people who have anything on their mind to switch from an attendee to a panelist. You can do that by logging out and logging back in. Also, there are lots of different ways for those who want to question. There's chat, there's QA, there's raise your hands. So all means are available. Just to break the ice here, I will go first, Andy. So in your estimation, there have been two sort of parallel forces, but working in probably opposite directions. There's the MDR on the other side of the pond, and then we have this EFS process, which has really been powered significantly in the United States. How are you seeing from your vantage point companies and their behaviors in terms of what they're doing and where they're elected to do, specifically in areas where you have programs built in the United States?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a great question. So two ways. One is for sponsors that traditionally have gone outside the United States to start because of it was easier before the EFS program. Now, because of the MDRs, have found it a little bit more challenging, less predictable, so have dipped their toes in the waters and tried our program. Hopefully, have been successful getting their EFS off the ground. The other is a more holistic approach, and that is it shouldn't be U.S. versus non-U.S. And there's no reason why for some sponsors, if they want to get started in Europe or Asia, elsewhere in the world, they can still come to U.S. At the same time. The idea is that if ultimately your goal is to market your device in the U.S., the earlier you get started here, the better, such that you engage the FDA, they're familiar with your technology, you get the sites up and running, they then transition to the pivotal trial because they already have the experience and also the support to just make that transition. So that's part of that value package as well.
Thank you, Andy.
Great. Any other question?
Actually, I have one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Andy, my question is, when this EFS program was first envisioned, was the thought that companies would be able to go from an EFS to a pivotal?
That actually came about more fortuitously. We actually initially envisioned it would go from EFS to the more traditional feasibility studies. But what we're seeing more often now is that sponsors can just continue to expand the EFS, get enough data, and then once they've reached that critical point, then then make that transition to pivotal without going through intermediate steps.
And in that regard, the EFS, even though you allow up to 15, you could do smaller Ellicots too, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Most commonly, it's EFS expansion under the same IDE. You've done your initial 15, then you submit submit a supplement for an additional 20 or what, and then expand the number of sites or operators, or you've decided to modify your device or the procedure and you want to test the next 15 with the modified device.
And I want to ask, I'll put somebody on the spot here just to make sure that we have people engaged. All right, Signa, thank you for jumping on. I'm going to call on you. Companies, when you are coming up with a new device and you're thinking about marketing it in the United States and all over the world, and you're thinking about getting that initial proof of concept, what are the things that you put into your calculus in terms of where you're going to do it? And how familiar are you with the EFS program, and what do you like about it and what you don't from your perspective?
Thanks, Adnan. Thanks for putting me on the spot. I appreciate that. No, as you know, we have actually utilized the EFS process for a number of new projects that we have that are ongoing, and I found that actually to be really useful because obviously it provides a faster pathway for us to get early data that is then important for allowing us to get to the next step in terms of determining whether or not, you know, we feel that the innovation is kind of worth the investment, and so that's been really useful. And we've obviously used you and the JI to help us out with a lot of those studies in the past, and so it's definitely a very useful pathway for us to get that early data that is required to help us make internal strategic decisions as well. And that's, I think, an important piece of this is for us to feel confident that we can move forward.
One other question, and maybe Shane, you're going to go next, so you can take this. Cost. What's the cost difference versus opportunity difference? What's the equation between the initial work being done in some unnamed place on the planet versus much more expensive clinical research in the United States? So any thoughts there from your perspective, and then you can continue with your.
Yeah, maybe that's a good intro. If I can pull up my slides, I'll get to that. And
perfect.
Not a great multitasker, so let me do one thing at a time here.
We can see them.
Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So thanks for that question, Dr. Siddiqui. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Chip, for the invitation. Well, first of all, I'm Shane Gleason. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for InspireMD, and I've also worn the hat of General Manager for North America, which involves bringing our products into the U.S. and what led us to the discussion of EFS. So kind of jumping to the end, this doesn't count in my 5 minutes, Chip. I'm answering a question first, then I'll get into this. It's really about how quickly, can you accelerate timelines? Can you reduce risk versus maybe at the end of the day, if you just launched into a pivotal trial, you could get to the end faster, but that end might not be in the right place. So we actually factored in the opportunity to do those 15 patients, fine-tune, look around, make sure we're on the right pathway, and probably an investment in time and money up front that likely saves you quite a bit later on. Yeah. Does that address the question there, Dr. Siddiqui?
That's fair, Shane. That is exactly the balance, right? It is a more upfront cost, but probably you save in terms of the efficiency of getting to a pivotal design in a faster, more effective way.
Yeah.
But go ahead, please.
Great. So again, thanks for the opportunity here to share some of our experience. I will, as a disclaimer, we have not completed this yet. We're just kicking it off. So love to share what we've learned along the way. So for starters, just a little bit of background on Inspire MD. Company's been around a long time, was initially founded with a focus on coronary intervention, but later refocused on the treatment of carotid disease with our core technology, which is a PET mesh covering, woven knitted PET mesh that goes on the outside of stents, and it's designed to prevent plaque prolapse and embolization. As Dr. Farb mentioned, doing an EFS doesn't need to be the first time you've ever treated humans with this. In fact, we've sold almost 50,000 stents outside of the US. We've completed a pivotal trial for protected carotid stenting, which includes carotid stenting with an embolic protection device. And we've presented the 30-day results from that pivotal trial in November of last year, and had the lowest major adverse event rates from any of the carotid pivotal trials. So this is not an experimental technology, but as stated on the slide here, and probably stating the obvious, it is still an investigational device in the US because we are still in the submission pathway for that. Incidentally, we also have another pivotal trial planned for the transcarotid delivery of this same carotid stent. So you can say that's a lot for a company our size. Why are you even entertaining doing anything else with an early feasibility study? And the way we look at this is, if you think about why you treat carotid disease, it's to prevent stroke. So the flip side of that is many strokes that we treat with thrombectomy are caused by carotid disease. And as stated here, 20 to 30% of strokes, of acute ischemic strokes, have tandem lesions, which I assume this group knows is defined as a lesion in the internal carotid combined with a thrombotic occlusion of an intracranial vessel. So the data here is kind of thin. What we do know is that thrombolysis does not work well. The patients do poorly. Endovascular thrombectomy does work well. The removal of clot, it's been proven effective and has been quickly implemented into the guidelines. But those guidelines and recommendations weren't based on high quality evidence of treating tandem lesions with thrombectomy because, as I learned quite a bit from Dr. Siddiqui, those patients were excluded from the majority of thrombectomy trials. So then we have the added layer and question of, on our way to do our stroke thrombectomy, what do we do about this occlusive carotid lesion that we encounter along the way? So a little bit on carotid disease itself, some images here on the left. Let me get this out of the way here. On the left of carotid disease, with and without treatment, images of different stents that are available today. And in short, carotid disease is embolic disease. We're treating it to prevent the embolization that leads to stroke. And there's strong evidence out there that there are differences in stent design. Closed cell stents tend to have lower event rates than open cell stents. And the second generation stents, like CGuard, have been shown to have lower event rates than first generation openers closed cell stents. And so that really the scaffolding matters. We also have the hypothetical advantage of we have high scaffolding without adding additional metal. So there's a hypothetical advantage, that relatively low metal burden on the anticoagulation and antiplatelet therapy needs, which is an important consideration when it comes to treating stroke patients. So the question is how and when to intervene. If you look at the carotid stenting guidelines, they will tell you to wait. They will say that endarterectomy or carotid stenting should be formed 8 to 14 days after a stroke. There's some literature, there's evidence, some of them are snapshotted on the right side of the screen here, that shows that you can perform endarterectomy as soon as 2 days after the stroke. But nowhere in the carotid intervention guidelines will you find a recommendation to stent or perform endarterectomy during a stroke. Now, the wrinkle here is that those carotid intervention guidelines were not written in the paradigm of thrombectomy for stroke, and it raises the question of, well, what do I do if I already have a catheter or a sheath in the neck? And I'm already taking on that procedural risk. The trade-off has always been, waiting decreases postoperative strokes, but doing it sooner can prevent those recurring strokes from happening or becoming more severe. So in terms of indications, again, we've completed a pivotal trial. In fact, when we had a pre-submission meeting with FDA, the question was raised, do you really need to do this? Won't you be on label? Can't you treat symptomatic patients today? And the answer to that is, in a way, yes. But our label will be for protected embolic or protected carotid stenting. So placing a carotid stent with embolic protection, which won't always be the case in these tandem lesions. So it raises the questions, and my next slide is kind of for discussion here, but what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here? Do we need to seek a label expansion for use without embolic protection devices, or perhaps a label specific to tandem lesions? Is that what we're trying to accomplish? Could this study or others lead to the characterization of balloon-tipped guide catheters, which are used to arrest flow during the procedure? Could that lead to them being characterized as embolic protection devices, which would lead to our device being used on label when used with embolic protection? And then the final question of what impact does this have on the on coverage and guidelines, both for stroke and for carotid intervention? So my final slide here, and this I might serve it up to Chip and Dr. Siddiqui for discussion. There are a lot of ways to gather data. We already talked a little bit about pros and cons of, do you start this outside of the US today? You could get there faster, but there's questionable value from a regulatory perspective. Do we wait until we have PMA approval under our planned indication and then proceed? Do we go directly into a pivotal trial, or at the bottom, kind of the reasons that we chose to proceed with early feasibility study here? But maybe we leave that for the discussion.
That's fantastic, Shane. Go ahead, Chip.
Well, I was just going to ask Shane, what was the, what were the defining criteria that led you to choosing an EFS to get the study going?
Yeah, I think, as labeled here, there are pros and cons to every approach. This is being done outside of the US today, and we're starting to see those data sets presented. But again, in terms of having a regulatory impact, in terms of leveraging it for expanding our label and kind of in parallel to the guidelines, because we all know that practice tends to follow what reimbursement allows operators to do and what guidelines recommend that operators do. So we want to have a positive impact on both of those. So it really came down to wanting to get forward momentum now, rather than wait, rather than commit to something. Because again, on that last slide, I showed all the questions. What is it? What is the label we're trying to get? Is it unprotected carotid stenting? Is it calling a balloon tip guide catheter embolic protection? Do we need a label specifically for tandem lesions? So we just had enough questions that leaping right into a pivotal trial did not make sense. But then the early feasibility study was the way to do that in the US and begin to engage FDA on it, engage the neuro community on it, and really importantly, getting to those answers right off the bat. And then this final point that I'll highlight is that there's not good recognition. These aren't the patients that were studied in the pivotal trials. We don't exactly know what good looks like. I mentioned our pivotal trial. We have a 30-day death stroke and MI rate of 0.95%. And, we compare that to the patients that we're treating here, where by definition, 100% of them are having events. So just really defining what success looks like, we thought it was wise to start in this kind of stepwise fashion.
Makes a lot of sense. I just want to make a comment here. In the early days when we first got started with early feasibility and Andy wrote, the guidance document and came out, the studies would go out and the ecosystem was so unfamiliar with it that it would take, 6, 9, 12 months, even longer to just negotiate a contract for an early feasibility study. And of course, I think for a sponsor, the calculus of what you do changes if it's going to take a year to get a study up and going in the US and collect the data. It doesn't matter what the cost is. And so a lot of the effort over the last 6 to 10 years has been, how do we make this so that we've got an efficient process within the US so that you can think about this. Still haven't solved cost, but been focused on efficiency.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chip, and something that we experienced. We've leaned on some of the regulatory prowess of the folks at JI, including I think individual who's the next speaker here, to learn the ropes of this. We were able to get a pre-submission meeting with FDA, which was very accommodating. It was actually an interesting scenario where all of our other carotid stenting has been done with the peripheral vascular branch, and here we kind of bridged over to the neuro branch. And both groups from FDA joined our pre-sub call. And in fact, one of the folks from the neuro branch wore a sweatshirt that said neuro on it for easy identification on the Zoom call, which was very thoughtful. Yeah, we got an audience quickly. The feedback has been very helpful and useful. And you're right, if it was going to be a year-long process to get to those answers, we probably would have just found ourselves waiting until we were approved before moving forward.
Yep. Well, we'll have you answer some questions later as we get into this. Carlos, you can start, teeing your slides up. But I would say that in general, the feedback from industry partners on FDA is that they have a very timely process. The real issue has been getting the study up and going with the clinical sites and working through contracting and CMS reimbursement. So for our audience here, that's where more of the issues have been, less with FDA and more with the clinical community.
I've got a quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Jim Pearson, I'm with NICO. Thank you for the invitation. How do you handle, I think I know the answer, but how do you handle intellectual property development or ideas that might come from an EFS study that's ongoing? Or is that already written in the contract? I mean, tell me a little bit about just your thoughts.
Yeah, we have on the web, if you go to the MDIC website, you'll see the Master Clinical Trial Agreement. And that came about because about 10 to 15 different sponsors together with clinical sites came together with their attorneys to discuss key issues, one of which was intellectual property. And it turns out that almost every sponsor has a concern about this, and sites have their own concerns. And so, what's in there is, a couple clauses with respect to intellectual property that sort of speak to common middle ground. And we found that a lot of newcomers, new startups were starting from scratch, trying to figure out how to work through that particular issue along with indemnification and CMS challenges. And so we've tried to streamline that by taking best practices from experienced sponsors and experienced clinical sites to give you a starting point that hopefully is practical. But in general, the idea is that you as a sponsor, you own your technology, it's your intellectual property. And by and large, the master agreements try and collect that. But Eileen will give you a link to that before we complete.
Okay.
And
yeah, thank you.
I see a question from Rado as well. Before you go ahead, I just want to sort of make a point that the MDIC template was originally developed for structural heart, and now it has gone through multiple iterations where that same master clinical trial agreement, the master informed consent document, they have been optimized for neurovascular as well as we start going into adjacent spaces. So this is a very useful resource that I can tell you involved in multiple EFSs. We really heavily rely on the material that's been produced thus far, and it's easily customizable. And that it does address, Jim, your concern, where IP typically is not under threat in EFS situations. But if one of your investigators thinks of a way better way of doing the same thing, you might have some competition on your hands.
Thank you, guys. This is great. I have a quick question, both from an investigator and let's say industry standpoint. U.S. is the most litigious environment, and I wonder, how do we handle EFS in, let's say, device malfunction? And we have this early feasibility study where where you potentially have problems or pitfalls, and is there any specific language related and how does the FDA protect investigators in industry from claims and lawsuits at this very early stage? A lot of people prefer to go in outside countries because of that issue.
Yeah,
And-
this is Chip. I mean, we'll have to move this separate, but it's a really good question because a lot of people are struggling with that point if they're not familiar with the system. But it turns out that there's clinical trial insurance that you're mandated to have in order to run a study, and that clinical trial insurance speaks very directly to the kinds of risks associated with that. A lot of this has been paved through structural heart studies by both small and big companies. And, we can put you in touch with a couple of those providers and outline some of the parameters that are, associated with that. But it's pretty insurable at a very reasonable cost. So just a little bit of background. We'll take that as a follow-up. Carlos, we move on to you.
Eileen, can you put his slides back on? I think there you go, Carlos. Good.
Yeah, he went.
So, can folks hear me?
Yeah, can you go to full screen?
Okay. See if I can do that. Is that full screen? Do you see that?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, it's actually you've got to switch the views. Oh, there you go. That's fine.
Okay. So folks who I haven't met, I see a lot of familiar faces, but also for folks I haven't met, I'm Carlos Pena, Chief Regulatory Officer and Chief Quality Officer at the Jacobs Institute. I am not an FDA person anymore. I used to be the Office Director for the Office of Neuro and Physiological Medicine Devices at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So I have a unique perspective, and I have 3 slides that maybe can add some best practices that I think many of you might know some of them, and hopefully you'll learn a couple new best practices that I've learned being both inside and outside the agency. The first one is the pre-submission process. I've talked a lot about that when I was at the agency. I still talk a lot about that outside the agency. It's a way to get free advice. There's not that many things that are free in the world anymore, but this is one of them that you can get, especially from FDA. I've often heard the comment that why should we do a pre-submission and approach to an EFS? And my response is a couple things. One is that if your strategy doesn't include a pre-submission step, it's not a very good strategy. But 2, for the early feasibility studies, especially when there's some novel tech involved, there's some maybe novel endpoints, new patient population, new technology, you want to share your expectations with the agency so that the agency can share their expectations on what you need to show with regard to safety and effectiveness to starting an early feasibility study and moving to a larger expanded study. There's also some data that shows that submissions that had a pre-submission component to the marketing submission process had a higher probability of success. So I think this all bodes to having early interactions with the agency. If you think it's too early to contact the FDA, that's the exact time to contact the agency. The second slide that I have is a slide that I hope Andy's familiar with. This shows the timelines of reviewing an IDE, an investigational device exemption, including early feasibility study IDEs. And this goes straight to Chip's comment in just a couple minutes ago that, back in fiscal year FY11, took a very long time to start those studies in the US. But after 13-14, FY14, FDA was able to get the median days down to approximately 30 days. That's an amazing accomplishment. I think that's like FDA's version of a Nature paper. And it speaks to not cutting corners, but it speaks to how the FDA, the staff really roll up their sleeves and hope to engage with many of the developers and innovators like yourself to getting these studies up and running. Many of the times, the IDEs are able to start it within 30 days is because they used a pre-submission, go back to my last slide, to set expectations about what that submission was coming in to the agency about. So these numbers have been.
Question. Let
Yep.
me ask you a question here, Carlos. I say this because I partly know it, but I want you to emphasize this aspect to the people on the call, is that the degree of interactiveness when you're doing an EFS submission versus a traditional IDE submission. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, I almost feel like there is greater energy and zest from the FDA side looking at these things and trying to really move them forward faster than traditional IDEs.
Yes, because they see this as a couple of things. They see this as a investment by the company in starting their studies in the US. This also speaks to the eagerness of the agency to getting these studies up and running. When these studies are not approved, that's not a win for the agency. They're always hoping that novel technologies that could potentially have a benefit to the patient are success, and starting that success process is with IDE studies in the clinic to begin with. The other thing that happens is that sponsors should expect, and I think I'm a little bit biased. Office of Neuro is some of the hardest working staff at the agency. They are really willing to engage with you on the submission to make sure that it gets to an approvable state, and that could be like Adnan, like we've seen many interactions over the course of 30 days. I think there's been examples of interactive occurrences of up to like 15 times for a 30-day period. So that's, FDA is very eager to succeed if there's a promising therapy for patients to benefit. The next slide here is just a last sort of bedtime reading in case you have some trouble falling asleep. You can always pick up this JNS article on EFS studies. It was just published a couple years ago, but it has best practices for neuro EFS. So it's specifically right down the avenue for folks on this call. It has information about final finished products. It has information about sterilization requirements. It has information about biocompatibility testing. It has information about GLP versus non-GLP animal studies. It has information about staged approaches. And so this last slide, if you're still wondering about should you do an EFS or not, start here, do some bedtime reading here. But I will also reach out to the Office of Neuro and the Office of Cardio, which Andy's well-known colleagues are in. I think you'll be surprised about the interaction you get with the agency. And it would almost maybe make folks pause to starting those studies overseas versus maybe they should start those studies here in the US. And I think I'll stop there, Adnan.
Yeah, Anand, I think maybe we, if there's a quick question or two, otherwise we might want to move on to our last speaker. And
Sure. I think Carlos just highlight the point is that what is really different compared to traditional IDEs is the high level of engagement, interactiveness, almost daily calls, daily back and forth between reviewers and sponsors to address the outstanding questions, which I think I find that refreshing, and eventually that would be nice to take to even a broader extent. But I think it's really where the interactions have been very positive. With that, we will move to our last speaker, my dear friend, Dr. Ansar Rai, who's chair of radiology at West Virginia University and has been involved in multiple early feasibility programs and early stage work, from neuroendovascular devices to the most recent 60-minute episode where you might have seen focused ultrasound being used for a variety of neurologic conditions. So there's a lot of innovation going on at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute, and it'd be great to hear your perspectives, Ansar.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. Obviously, see a lot of friends, familiar faces. So this is not going to be that novel I think for the people, at least I see, maybe they're more on the audience. And Carlos asked me to share these presented at the SNIS. It's somewhat of a provocative title, as Dr. Farb mentioned earlier. The US or the Europe they're not mutually exclusive. But this is purely a physician perspective. Early on, I was completely unaware of the the trials and tribulations that someone goes through in developing and conceiving a device and dealing with the FDA, and the cost and the time involved from conception all the way to implementation for a newer device. What we did notice at multiple meetings that as a physician in the US, there was a circuitous route of a device conception, early feasibility study elsewhere, CE mark, and then finally FDA approval and the device is available in our hands. And from a physician's perspective, we always thought, why is it that way? And that was when talking to my colleagues on the industry side, certainly, and those who had conceived of ideas, the perception was that the pathway in the US was much longer than in Europe, and the ease of use and the shortage of the demands was much more on the European side. But now, courtesy of the MDR, that has changed. And again, this is not unfamiliar to many. A lot of it is based on Dr. Farb's paper that he showed earlier. But these two pathways are becoming fairly equivalent in terms of device classification, clinical evidence requirement, and post-market surveillance, et cetera. There may be some differences in some of the notifying bodies, but overall, the MDR has come up to parity with the FDA rather than the FDA relaxing its regulations. Certainly the time that Dr. Corpenia showed has been shortened on the US side, which has further made these evaluations equal. So the timing of submission, the continuous clinical data update, once the device is approved, demonstration of safety, efficacy, there's some difference in the notified body involvement. The clinical evaluation reports are getting similar. And when I look at the MDR and the FDA, there's still, on a very superficial view, there is a lot of similarity, but on terms of deeper granular perspective, there are still differences that are relevant to someone bringing a device, meaning they would have to still do the same work twice. One is not, it's not translatable to the other. But both have a very high emphasis on clinical data, a risk-based approach, and a post-market surveillance. The submission guidelines, the big question is that, are there ways that both these regulatory bodies can accept a similar documentation or submission? And that is a question for Dr. Pena, Dr. Farb. So far, the EU is currently participating as an observer. I could read a recent report that there is some move towards making these more as a single device audit program, but that is still not in place. And you can, if you go and Google companies that help physicians or vendors bring a device to the market, they have these packages for FDA and for MDR. There is a little bit more overlap, but still the submission processes are different, which means that the cost is still double, and the length of time is more similar between EU and the US because of the MDR than it used to be. So it's possible that there is conception, GLP, or clinical trial, FDA approval, and simultaneous CE mark and dissemination elsewhere. But we have seen increased number of EFS and FS programs in the US, but there is still quite a bit of large number of EFS studies that are OUS, mainly because of not only just the perception, but that the cost of conducting an EFS study or a GLP study is lower OUS than in US, which can put people away. I'm gonna skip this. This has already been covered. EFS doesn't have to be first in human, but limited number of cases. The advantages have already been described, and to me, the biggest advantage is early engagement of the FDA. Having personally gone through a couple of these and then working on the DSMB of others, that early engagement has been critical in defining device iteration, because EFS allows that, in defining whether you want to go to a feasibility or a pivotal. And I think the biggest benefit of MDIC, if we can achieve that, is providing the FDA a single platform, say, for example, contracting with centers that have signed on to it, shared informed consent procedures, uploading data into EDCs, CFRs, etc. That is what I think, once is established, will move the needle in terms of how quickly these studies are initiated and adopted. I will stop here because of time, and
well, thank you, Ansar. That was terrific. Why don't we go to full screen so that we can have a general conversation? And I want to make sure that we're talking real directly, because we can make this all sound strategically very good, but not everyone is running to jump into the swimming pool that way. And I think there are real issues that are challenging for people to run an early feasibility study. The FDA is actually pretty straightforward, but actually getting a study off the ground in the US turns out to be more problematic, and we've not really fully, as an ecosystem, solved that issue. But and the issues are different for big companies versus small companies. I think big companies can look to other divisions that have had experience, say, in structural heart, and say, wow, we could probably implement this. What are the lessons learned? Small companies are reinventing the wheel over and over again. And so I think that one of the issues we've been trying to do with these kinds of meetings is get the word out and try and collaborate across the space so that we lift the tide for everyone. But I put the question to the larger group. Why do you think that in neurovascular there hasn't been more activity in this area? And I'd look to everybody to respond on any thoughts, or we can have other questions.
I think people are going to be very hesitant, so you'll have to pick on somebody.
I'll jump in. Hi, for those who haven't met, I'm Chaz McCann. I'm the CEO of Silk Road Medical, and I'm only 3 months in here, so my comments are actually a little more broad than that. Although I certainly have talked to our team at Silk Road and Rick Rudy, who many of you know, but I'm also recently was at Apollo Endosurgery in the GI and bariatric space. And then I also reached out to some former colleagues in the ENT space. And first of all, I completely agree with that the paradigm has evolved a lot in about 10 years, right? I think many of us are old enough to remember where you pretty much defaulted to go to Europe or Latin America or Australia and have, logged the miles to run trials. And so I think we really are making progress, but a lot of this discussion has been on cost. And when I polled people from each of those 3 different organizations before this call, a consistent theme that still came up was inclusion-exclusion criteria, and still a relative conservatism in the FDA mindset, in that balance of which patients get involved. And if in a period where time is money, that can be a huge difference. And if you end up with a study that you literally can't enroll, that becomes, almost dead on arrival. And so I think I'm not sure if others have shared that experience, but again, I was surprised that it came up. All 3 mentioned it as an area where it just still feels easier outside the US to get a study going with a patient population that isn't too limited.
Yep. Thanks, Chad. Other comments?
Suzanne has her hand up.
Yeah. So hi there, Chip. I'll answer your question, and I'll follow it up with a question of my own if I can. And for those who don't know me, I'm Suzanne Lascalza from Cerenovus. And so to answer your question, Chip, you think we have been very serious and interested in pursuing the EFS pathway, and we've thought about it for our recent products that have come up. And I can say for the very most recent one, we decided to do our first in human outside of the US. And the reason was that the physician who had been very intimately involved in the development of the program and the preclinical testing was outside the US. And we wanted to keep that physician to be the primary person engaged. And my question to you, since I've been participating, and we as a company have been participating for the last couple of years since you guys kicked this off at an SNIS meeting a few years ago, I'm curious to see what has been the uptick of activity of EFS in the neurovascular space over the last couple of years since this has started.
It's a great question. I don't know if you have the statistics, Andy. The last time I saw statistics were from Carlos's era, when the neuro guys were neck and neck with the cardiac guys, primarily because of neuromodulation, not so much neurovascular. We have, I think, 7 or 8 EFSs all in the neurovascular space right now. But Andy, do you have more recent figures for number of EFSs ongoing for neuro versus cardiac?
Can you see the
Yes.
screen? Yeah, so
Yes.
I just got these data today, actually. And neuro, this is EFS the last fiscal year, and you see neuro is biggest, at just even despite the loss of Carlos here. But I don't have it broken down by neurovasc versus structural neuro or other neuro. So so we could look into that, but I think the sense is that this is an area that we'd like to see more growth in. I think that seems to be you know, and why we're having this call. And I appreciate, you know, the feedback from Chaz about, you know, inclusion criteria. And those are the things that we, you know, certainly want to hear about, because a study, an IDE approval that doesn't enroll, it might as well be a disapproval, right? You don't get there, you know. So those are the kind of things that sometimes, you know, I get involved in when there might be you know, some new thinking or, you know, different approaches to try to get these things off the ground, or really understand, you know, what is getting in the way of getting, you know, the study going.
This is perfect. Thank you, Andy. This is exactly the kind of data. And it'll be interesting to see how much is still neuromodulation versus neurovascular. But I had a question, and I'll pick on Patrick. So Patrick is unique because he's interventional neuroradiologist, long-time practicing physician all over Europe. And most recently, he is now leading medical affairs at Cerenovus. So he has extensive experience on the MDR side, early feasibility, first-in-man studies there. And then, you know, it's part of the same strategic group. So your thoughts on considerations and what makes you weigh doing it here versus doing it anywhere else in the US. And I see you, Penny. We'll go to you next.
Thank you, Adnan. And I'm almost inclined to say ladies first, but I'll take the question and the answer. I was about to raise my hand because actually I see something that I didn't see in Europe before. So when MDD became MDR, there was a major change, and people thought, oh, what is going to happen in Europe with first in human studies? Can we still publish first in human studies because the US will be first? And that's something that is a fear in Europe, and I think it might happen in the US. But if I talk to startup companies, for example, in the US, and I hear how their engagement with FDA takes place, some of them are open and really want to talk to FDA and see how they can get this process going. At the same time, there is a number of companies that say, well, we don't want to talk too much to them because, you know, let sleeping dogs lie. It might be that we trigger something and then suddenly they will raise the bar and we have a problem as a startup company. And that has to do with cost, but it has to do what was brought up earlier, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And especially in the realm of stroke, where there is such a swift progress in all the data that we get from the studies, the guidelines are not updated, and therefore FDA is years behind in what they consider to be the standard of care. And that for startup companies is very difficult. And that means that a lot of startup companies reach out to other areas. And that means that Europe is not the first to go to, but they go to regions that are less restrictive. Let's not name countries, but yeah, people know where they go to.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That's very helpful. Penny, you had raised your hand.
I was just going to comment that some of the reasons for maybe not having as many EFS studies in the US would be 510(k) submissions versus PMA.
You know, I think that is a good point, but part of what we're dealing with now is there's just so much innovation going on in the neurovascular space, sort of like structural heart, with every day you hear something new about a tricuspid or a mitral or all kinds of structural diseases. The same kind of thing is going on in the neuromodulation and neurovascular space. So I think it's prime opportunity for us to sort of leverage that. But I'm going to pitch this question to my co-moderator, Chip. So Chip, you ran Abbott Vascular for a long time. You are now leading a startup as well. You've been part of, I think you spent an entrepreneur in residence at the FDA for a few years and now have been championing MDIC. How do we optimize this, and how can MDIC help the startup strategics? I know a lot of people are part of MDIC already, at least the strategics, but how can these get engaged, and what tangible benefits can these companies derive from your advice and counsel in the EFS process?
Hey, well, thanks for the softball. Yeah, I'm excited to chat a little bit about this. I do want to weave an answer back to this question of, because I've observed now early feasibility in structural heart, electrophysiology, and now neurovascular, and watched how the field has evolved. And one of the things I've noticed about electrophysiology, which has been the hardest to get early feasibility studies going, is the clinical practice is very similar US versus Europe. Structural heart, geez, the follow-up, the anticoagulation methodologies, et cetera, are vastly different. And so I think structural heart has moved to early feasibility in the US largely because that's where the patients are and that's where the opportunity is to treat patients. And neurovascular somewhere in between. There's a lot of common practice between Europe and US, but there are differences in the patient populations. And that's why we featured Shane's story. If you want to explore different clinical practices and expand indications, I think that's a big opportunity for EFS and neurovascular. And if you looked at Andy's pie chart and you saw so many of those studies, a good number of those, by the way, are physician-led studies in the neurovascular space where people are exploring novel patient populations. So maybe the first device to one speaker's comment, might get done outside the US. But if you're really going to talk about a comprehensive strategy, you might actually be making use of early feasibility studies in expanded patient populations in an approach similar to what you saw with Inspire MD. The other thing I would say is a lot of folks from big companies and small companies, people like all of you around the table, have a real passion for regulatory science and the recognition of what kind of business leaders you are to be engaged in, the challenges of our time. And, one of the things that's been really useful and enjoyable to be a part of MDIC is to have active engagement with in the pre-competitive space with people who are working on the same kinds of issues together with FDA to collectively solve problems. And so if you have a passion in that more broadly or specifically for early feasibility, I would encourage you to raise your hand to Eileen Mijas and be part of any number of working groups that are trying to solve problems for us collectively. And it's a great place. There's everyone who is working in the area is very forthcoming and free with their experience. So it's a great way to network and find out, geez, how do I do this? How do I solve, the kind of problem I'm dealing with? So I'd encourage you to explore just that, and Eileen can help you there. So I don't know that I really answered fully your question there. On other than say that, we've worked collaboratively together to try and make it a better ecosystem for the therapeutic category. And I think we both have seen progress over the last couple of years, and we expect that, the continued outreach and collaborative work together with FDA is going to, make this a better process for everyone.
I think there is relative inertia and lack of confidence in terms of how things have been traditionally done. So there's always a little bit of an additional risk, but that's what this meeting is about, and other ventures. And for those of us who have ventured into this process, we have found this refreshingly efficient. Andy, your hand went up first, and then we'll go to Carlos next.
Right, and I think maybe I'm glad to see, because my question was to him, because we had two speakers talk about the issues with inclusion criteria and guidelines, and maybe Carlos from his position could have some recommendations or some practical advice on how to deal with that particular issue.
Yeah, so I had a comment on that one and a question back to you, Andy, but on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, I would encourage folks not to be, hesitant to contact the agency if they think that that's going to come up either in an EFS design or a pivotal study. That's exactly what the pre-submission process is for. If you want to even be more informal outside the pre-submission process, which is pretty informal, I would encourage you to, make sure you connect and bump into people at the annual conferences, SNIS, AANS, CNS, which has FDA staff, which you can then also, connect with management there and talk to FDA staff about maybe your concerns or questions about inclusion and exclusion criteria. I think if you put that in a pre-submission, it's less likely to be an issue down the line, especially if you're concerned about enrollment. The one solution that I thought I'd put out to the group is that, and Adnan, this is, I'd like to claim my responsibility for this idea, but that, people are investigating whether they can do an EFS, one US site, one OUS site. And maybe that might sort of keep everyone at bay a little bit and keep everyone trying to innovate here in the US, but also get advantage of overseas. And I didn't know if Andy had any words of wisdom, because you often have words of wisdom. Maybe you have some words of wisdom on what people should be thinking about if they want to do this two-prong approach, which would still get the study started in the US kind of first.
Absolutely, and we're very open to that. And that the idea is that it's a continuous stream of information to help support, which is the goal. The goal line is getting to pivotal trial. So whatever data you can bring to the table, as long as it's good quality data, we're interested in looking at it. And if it's 2 sites in Europe and 1 site in New Zealand and 2 sites here, that's fine. It's really whether the sponsor is able, this works for them. Or there could be a slightly modified patient population in other locations, again, to help get to the amount of information needed for the pivotal trial.
Well, that's I learned something there, so thank you, Andy. I wasn't quite sure that we could do these combinations, but I think that is very promising, because I think that could allay many of the concerns. It allows people to maybe defray some of the higher upfront costs, and as in the United States, and combine that with some OUS sites. So that might be a unique perspective to explore. Any other comments or questions from anybody? I see Rob Abrams, I see Pete Forsyth. I see lots of familiar faces here. Any final questions before we are coming to the end of our time here? Rob, go ahead. You're mute.
Yeah, thank you. Rob Abrams, representing Konica and also Epic Neuro, which is a startup in neurostim for stroke recovery. And I just want to make the comment and open it up as to, having been in this field a long time developing neurovascular products, we do have reasonable bench and animal study models to know that we're ready for a more traditional study. But as we see going forward, the intersection of neurostim and neurovascular coming together, now we're dealing with more qualitative human outcomes, such as, does this device really work? We can't tell that from an animal study. Are we getting, say, good stroke recovery from this device? There's almost no animal model to tell you that. So I think going forward, and Adnan knows this very well, there's almost no other vehicle other than an early feasibility where you could do 5 to 10 patients with a device to assess, is this stimulation parameter or recording parameter really doing what I want? There's almost no other way. And I think, given appropriate safety pre-studies, we can get there. And not to be parochial, but we're kind of ready to do that. And we're more familiar with a traditional pre-sub approach. So I guess my question is, if you come forward with an early feasibility study that says, I want to open 3 centers and do a few patients, can you then morph it into a more randomized study without having to change tremendously your protocol and continue going, and again, with a small company budget?
Andy, I'll let you take that.
The answer is yes to all that. Exactly. Through because you get, by getting the idea approved, you have the buy-in, accepting more unknowns from the review team, and part of risk mitigation is more interaction of how things are going in progress reports, which may be more formal or informal context of how things are going, and such that then you want to expand the EFS from that initial 5 or 10 to 20 at the same sites or additional sites, and under the same, you just submit an expansion, and you already have what you've learned, and you have all the documentation ready to go and get those sites up and going. So that's the ideal. And then not going through a separate feasibility, separate standalone, and go transition then to a pivotal trial once you have enough data.
No, that would be wonderful, and I think doing it in the U.S. is important for follow-up to the patients, and also this is a new expanding area, and we've got great innovators here, and it kind of lends itself to that.
Thank you very much, everybody. Chip, any final closing thoughts from
No,
you?
I want to thank everybody, thank our speakers for dedicating the time. And of course, you've got plenty of opportunity via email to follow up. We're happy to have any conversation you want and reschedule if you'd like to do that. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.